At 6:58 in the morning, on October 25th, 1944, a young lookout aboard a tiny American warship saw something on the horizon that should not have been there. 4 Japanese battleships rising out of the dawn, haze off the island of Samar. Leading them was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel and guns. The ship beneath the lookout's feet weighed barely 1,700 tons. Her captain picked up the intercom and told 224 men the truth. This was a fight they were not expected to survive. And then, instead of running, this little ship turned toward the most powerful fleet on Earth and attacked. What 4 of her sailors did in the next 2 hours would leave the entire Japanese fleet stunned, confused. And finally, in retreat, this is the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, of a gunner who would not let go of his last shell, and of a captain who refused to let his men give up, even when the sea itself seemed determined to swallow them whole. Before we begin, pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea. Take a quick look at the clock. What time is it where you are right now? Let us know in the comments. Then sit back and enjoy today's World War II story. The sea off Samar was calm that morning. A soft gray light spread across the water, and the air smelled of salt and warm steel. Aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the men were tired but easy. For weeks, their work had been simple and safe. They were a destroyer escort, a small ship built to hunt submarines and to guard the slow escort carriers that carried aircraft to the invasion beaches. Their job was to screen, to shepherd, to protect. Nobody expected them to fight a battleship. Nobody expected them to fight at all. The Roberts was small. She weighed a little more than 1,700 tons, a fraction of what a real warship carried. She had 2 5-inch guns, a rack of torpedoes, and a crew of 224 men. Most of them were young. Their average age was barely past 20. Some had never seen combat. They had been together for exactly 5 months and 27 days since the ship was first placed in service. And in that short time, they had become something more than a crew. They had become a family. They trusted the men beside them. They trusted the officer who led them. They had learned each other's habits, each other's jokes, each other's fears in the long, quiet weeks at sea. And now, without knowing it, they were about to learn something far harder about one another. That officer was Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. He was a lawyer before the war, a calm man with a steady voice and steady hand. He knew his ship, he knew every rivet of her thin hull, and he knew exactly what she could and could not do. What she could not do was survive a fight against battleships no destroyer escort ever had. In the entire Pacific War, more than 50 of these little ships had been placed in service, and not one of them had ever traded fire with an enemy battleship. It simply was not their purpose. Their purpose was to live, to guard, to bring the boys home. At 6:58 in the morning, that purpose ended high on the ship. A lookout stared at the northwest horizon and felt his stomach turn to ice. Shapes were rising out of the haze. Not clouds, not islands. Ships, enormous ships, their pagoda masts, climbing into the sky like the towers of some drowned cathedral. He counted 4 of them, and behind the 4 came more, a forest of masts and funnels stretching across the water. The lookout called it down, and the word ran through the Roberts like a current of cold electricity. A Japanese fleet, roughly 15 miles away, and it was coming straight for them. In the pilot house, Copeland took the report and did not let his face change. He walked to the intercom, lifted the microphone, and pressed the button His voice carried into every compartment of the ship, to the men in the engine room, the gun mounts, the magazines, the galley. He told them the truth because they had earned the truth. A large Japanese force had been sighted, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, a screen of destroyers, all of it steaming directly toward the American task force. And then he said the words that every man aboard would carry for the rest of his life, however long or short that life turned out to be. This, he told them, would be a fight against overwhelming odds, a fight from which survival could not be expected. They would do what damage they could while they still could. For a moment the ship was silent. Then the men went to their stations. The numbers were almost beyond understanding. The Japanese center force was a fist of 23 warships, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. Together, they displaced roughly 200,000 tons of armor and firepower. At the front of the formation sailed Yamato herself, 72,000 tons. The heaviest and most powerful battleship the world had ever seen, her main guns were 18.1 inches across, monsters that hurled shells weighing more than 3,000 pounds across distances of 15 miles and more. A single one of those shells weighed more than a small truck. A single one could tear a ship like the Roberts completely in half. Against all of that stood Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers built on the hulls of merchant ships, thin-skinned and slow, designed to launch planes against submarines and troops ashore, never against a battle line. Screening them were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 7 small ships. Their combined weight came to perhaps 25,000 tons. The Japanese outweighed them by roughly 8-1. It was not a battle. On paper, it was an execution. And here was the cruelest part, the truth that made the men's blood run cold when they understood it. They were supposed to have protection. Somewhere over the horizon, there was meant to be a wall of American battleships, the great gray giants of the Third Fleet, ready to shield the invasion from exactly this kind of attack. That was the plan. That was the promise. The wall was not there. During the night, the American admiral commanding the powerful battleship force had taken every one of his heavy ships and raced north, chasing a group of Japanese aircraft carriers that had appeared far away. The carriers were bait, a decoy meant to pull the strongest American ships out of position, and the trick had worked perfectly. The giants had gone hunting, and they had left Taffy 3 completely alone off Samar. There were no battleships coming to help. There was no wall. There were only 7 little ships, and the men who crewed them standing between the enemy and the vast, vulnerable invasion fleet gathered in the Gulf behind them. It should never have happened. American intelligence had reported that this same Japanese force was retreating, beaten back by air attacks the day before, limping away to lick its wounds. The reports were wrong. The enemy had not retreated in the dark hours before dawn, near 3 in the morning. The entire center force had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait, silent and undetected, and had come out the other side hunting. Now they were here exactly where no one believed they could be, closing the distance at 30 knots. The escort carriers could make 18 knots at their very best. Simple arithmetic told the story. They could not run. They could not hide. The enemy was faster, and the enemy was coming deep in the belly of the Roberts. In the heat and roar of the engine rooms, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge heard his captain's words come over the intercom. He understood at once what they meant. A destroyer escort like his was held to a strict limit, a top speed the Navy set for safety, around 24 knots. Careful mechanisms guarded the boilers, keeping their pressure inside the bounds the designers had drawn. Those limits existed to protect the ship, to protect the men, to keep the machinery from tearing itself apart. Trowbridge looked at the gauges, and he thought about the enemy closing in, and he made a decision. 24 knots would not be enough. 24 knots meant dying slowly, uselessly, without ever reaching the enemy. So he walked to the main control panel, and one by one he began to shut down and bypass every safety system the Navy had installed. His men watched him do it. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. They knew exactly what he was doing, and they knew exactly why he was betting the ship and their lives on the chance to strike a blow. He was going to drive those boilers past everything they were built to endure, and hope that the old steel held together long enough to matter. In the engine room, the temperature was already brutal. The steam pressure gauges trembled, and Trowbridge kept working, calm and deliberate, unlocking every last measure of speed the little ship had been forbidden to use. Up above, on the open bridge, Copeland watched the enemy formation spread across the sea. It was a terrifying sight, beautiful and monstrous at once. The Japanese fleet was fanning out across 10 miles of ocean. Yamato held the center like a mountain, moving on the water. Heavy cruisers ranged out along the flanks, their guns already swinging toward the American carrier. Between them, the enemy destroyers formed a moving fence of steel to do any good at all. The Roberts would have to charge into that fence, run straight through a storm of fire, and get close enough to loose her handful of torpedoes before she was blown out of the water. Copeland knew the math better than anyone. His torpedoes could reach out about 5,000 yards, a little under 3 miles. But to get within that range, the Roberts would have to sail toward ships that could hit a target from more than 25,000 yards away. For every mile his ship advanced, the enemy would have long minutes to pour shells down upon her. She had no armor worth the name. Her hull plating was thin enough that a large shell might pass clean through without even slowing down. There was nothing to protect these young men except speed and smoke and their own refusal to quit. The moment hung in the balance. Behind the Roberts lay the escort carriers, and behind them lay the invasion fleet, thousands of soldiers and sailors who had no idea that 7 small ships were all that stood between them and the guns of Yamato. Ahead lay the enemy, vast and certain of victory, and somewhere in that narrow space between them, Robert Copeland made his choice. He would not simply die screening the carriers. He would take his tiny ship straight at the heart of the most powerful fleet on Earth, and he would make them pay for every yard. The order came down, prepare to attack. In the engine room, Trowbridge finished his work and gripped the controls. In the gun mounts, boys who had trained for months against paper targets loaded live shells with shaking hands. And on the bridge, Copeland looked out at Yamato and gave the word that would carry the Samuel B. Roberts into history. At 7:05, the order that changed everything came down from the flagship. Admiral Clifton Sprague, watching his carriers about to be overrun, ordered his little screen to attack. It was a desperate command, almost an unthinkable one. 7 small ships were being sent to charge a battle line that outweighed them 8-1. But there was no other choice. Every minute the small boys could buy was a minute the carriers might use to escape. The 3 destroyers turned first. Johnston, Hoole, and Harriman swung their bows toward the enemy and drove forward into the guns. Behind them came the 4 destroyer escorts, and the Samuel B. Roberts was the last ship in the line. Copeland watched the destroyers race ahead, watched the sea around them begin to boil with shell splashes, and knew his turn was coming. There were only minutes now before the Japanese gunners found his ship and began the work of tearing her apart. At 7:16, the destroyer Johnston opened fire Her shells arced away toward the enemy, tiny sparks against the gray steel of the battle line. The Japanese answer came at once, and it was overwhelming. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo came screaming down, and where they struck, the water rose in columns 200 feet high, taller than the destroyer's own mast. For a moment, Johnston vanished completely, swallowed by smoke and towering white water. Then she came out the other side, still firing, still charging. At 23 minutes past 7, it was the Roberts' turn. Copeland ordered flank speed, and deep below, Trowbridge's ruined safeties gave up their last secrets. The little ship surged forward, past 24 knots, past 25, past 26, until she was making 28 knots, 4 knots faster than anything her designers had ever intended. The whole hull shook with the effort. Metal groaned somewhere down in her bones. The pressure needles in the engine room climbed into the red and stayed there, trembling. Nobody cared. Every man aboard understood the simple truth of that morning. Speed was life. Speed was the only shield they had. The enemy fleet spread across 10 miles of ocean ahead of them. Yamato steamed in the center like a moving fortress. On the right flank ran the heavy cruiser Chikuma, well ahead of the battleship. Behind her came the cruiser Tone. On the left, the cruisers Haguro and Chokai were bearing down on the American carriers, their guns already flashing. Between all of them, the enemy destroyers laid a screening line. To reach torpedo range, the Roberts would have to pierce that screen, close to within 5,000 yards, fire her fish, and somehow live long enough to turn away 5,000 yards, under 3 miles. It sounded close, against ships that could hit a target from more than 25,000 yards away. It was an eternity. At 32 minutes past 7, the shells began to fall around the Roberts in earnest. 8-inch rounds from the heavy cruiser Chikuma walked across the water toward her. The Japanese loaded their shells with colored dye so that each ship's splashes could be told apart, and now green geysers rose around the little destroyer escort. One shell struck the sea 50 yards off the port bow. Another slammed down 20 yards to starboard. The water climbed higher than the mast and came crashing back across the deck. Copeland stood on the bridge and called for hard left rudder, then hard right, weaving the ship in a desperate zigzag, never holding a straight course for more than a few seconds. It was the only way to spoil the enemy's aim, to keep their rangefinders forever a step behind. Each turn bought a heartbeat. Each heartbeat carried them a few yards closer in the forward 5-inch gun mount. Lieutenant William Burton crouched with his crew and waited for the range to close. His men had trained for 6 months. They had fired thousands of practice rounds. They had never once fired at a battleship. With a good crew, the gun could throw 15 rounds a minute. And Burton had a good crew. What he did not have was ammunition to waste. Between his 2 mounts, he carried around 600 rounds, roughly 300 for each gun. At full rate of fire, that meant only about 20 minutes of shooting before the ship ran completely dry. If they fired carelessly, the guns would fall silent long before the battle ended. So Burton watched and waited and held his fire and felt the shells falling closer around him. His gun crew was 10 men, a loader, a rama, a powderman, a fusée-setter, a trainer, a pointer, the gun captain, and 3 men to handle the ammunition. Their average age was 22. 2 of them had never seen combat before this morning. The other 8 had chased submarine contacts, had heard the distant thump of depth charges, but that was nothing like this. Submarines did not shoot back with 14-inch guns. Submarines did not throw water 200 feet into the sky. These boys were learning, in the space of a few terrible minutes, what real war felt like At 38 minutes past 7, Copeland's voice came over the intercom again, steady as ever. They were closing for a torpedo attack. The Roberts was 7,000 yards from the cruiser Chikuma. Still too far. He needed another 2,000 yards. 2 more minutes at 28 knots. 2 more minutes of shells falling like rain. A single direct hit from one of those 8-inch rounds would punch through the ship's thin plating and burst inside, killing everyone in the compartment. It found the forward gun mount was protected by armor barely more than 1/3 of an inch thick, enough to stop shrapnel and splinters, nothing more. If a real shell struck it squarely, all 10 men inside would die in an instant, without ever knowing what hit them, and so they waited and closed the range and did not run. At 40 minutes past 7, the Roberts crossed the line 5,000 yards from Chikuma, torpedo range. At last, Copeland gave the order, and 3 torpedoes leaped from the tubes on the starboard side and splashed into the sea. Their wakes traced 3 white lines across the water, running out toward the cruiser at nearly 50 knots. The time to target was about 2 minutes. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and true, exactly as they were meant to. The instant they were away, Copeland threw the ship into a hard turn, reversing course, driving for the cover of the smokescreen before the enemy could pin down where the attack had come from. Aboard Chikuma, a lookout saw the wakes and shouted the alarm. The cruiser heeled hard to port in an emergency turn, 8,000 tons of warship leaning over as her rudder went to the stops. The first torpedo passed just ahead of her bow. The second slid past her stern. The third ran directly beneath her hull and did not explode. The contact detonators on those American torpedoes failed nearly half the time. And this was one of the bad ones. In a matter of seconds, the Roberts had fired 3 torpedoes and scored nothing. 3 duds. It should have been a bitter, useless failure, but it was not useless at all. In turning to comb the torpedo tracks, Chikuma had swung away from the American carriers and broken off her attack run entirely. The heavy cruiser was now steaming to the northwest, away from Taffy 3. She had lost precious minutes. The escort carriers used to run south minutes that carried them a little closer to any hope of rescue. Copeland had not sunk her. He had done something in that moment that mattered nearly as much. He had made her flinch. And in a battle where time itself was the only thing worth fighting for, making the enemy flinch was a kind of victory. At 45 minutes past 7, the Roberts came out of the smoke. Chikuma had finished her turn and steadied back onto a course toward the carriers. But she was 8,000 yards off. Now, too far for another torpedo run, so Copeland turned to the only weapon he had left. He ordered Burton to open fire with the forward 5-inch gun. The mount swung onto the target and rose to its highest elevation. Then it fired. The first shell left the barrel and climbed into the sky. And 12 seconds later, it fell 400 yards short. Burton adjusted and fired again. 200 yards short, he walked the fall of shot in patient and precise, the way he had been trained. The third round splashed close beside the cruiser's bow. The fourth round hit. The shell struck Chikuma's forward superstructure, punched inside, and burst. Smoke poured from the wound. And Burton's crew, seeing it, settled into a rhythm as steady and relentless as a heartbeat. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. 15 rounds a minute. The barrel grew hot. The recoil mechanism cycled again and again. Spent brass casings clattered and piled up inside the cramped mount. After 5 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had thrown 75 rounds at the enemy and scored hits. He could not fully measure through the smoke. The cruiser was still shooting. She was still closing on the carriers, But she knew now that the little ship had teeth. At 52 minutes past 7, Chikuma turned her attention fully on the Roberts. Her 8-inch guns shifted, and the shells began landing close, then closer, then terrifyingly close. One burst 30 yards to port. Shrapnel rattled against the hull like hail. Another struck 20 yards to starboard, and the blast wave rocked the whole ship. A third slammed into the sea just 10 yards off the bow, and the splash came down across the forward gun mount in a solid green wall of water. The sea poured through the gun ports and swirled around the ankles of Burton's crew. They kept firing. The gun had been built to work wet because it had to be, but this was not a drill in a training tank. This was the real thing. And the enemy was finding the range across the water. The battle was going hard against the American ships. At 3 minutes past 8, the destroyer Johnston took a 14-inch shell from the battleship. Congo squarely on her bridge. The blast killed her executive officer and wounded her captain, the fierce commander who had led the charge. Her speed fell away to 17 knots, and control of her steering had to be shifted all the way aft. Still, she kept firing. 3 miles to the north, the destroyer Hull was locked in her own duel with the heavy cruiser Haguro. She had already been hit again and again. One of her forward gun mounts was wrecked. An engine room had flooded. She was down to 15 knots on a single engine, and still she came on. Still she fired. A wounded ship refusing to fall, the Roberts was still whole, still making 28 knots, still hammering away at Chikuma. But her ammunition was bleeding away with every salvo. After 18 minutes of steady fire, Burton's forward gun had thrown 270 rounds, 9/10 of everything that Mount carried. He had 34 rounds left. At the rate his crew was working, that was little more than 2 minutes of shooting before the forward gun fell silent forever. At 7 minutes past 8, Copeland ordered Burton to shift to a new target. The heavy cruiser Tone had closed to 7,000 yards, nearer than Chikuma and far more dangerous. Tone carried 8 of the big 8-inch guns, and she was pouring fire onto the escort carrier Gambier Bay, her salvos creeping closer to the little carrier with every shot. Burton swung his mount onto the new bearing, adjusted his elevation, and fired. The first round fell short. He corrected and fired again, and hit. The shell struck Tone's number 2 turret, drove through the armored face, and exploded inside. The turret stopped turning. It stopped firing with a single 5-inch gun, a weapon that was never supposed to be able to harm a cruiser at all. Burton had just knocked out a quarter of that ship's main battery. At 10 minutes past 8, the forward gun fired its last round. 304 shots gone. The barrel was scorching, the metal glowing a dull, angry red. The recoil mechanism was beginning to fail. Its springs crushed past every limit the designers had set. Oil smoking in the recuperator. Burton and his men had driven that gun far past anything the Navy believed possible. And now it was finished. The forward mount had nothing left to give, but the Roberts still had one gun, aft, under a young gunner's mate named Paul Henry Carr. The after 5-inch mount still had ammunition, more than 300 rounds. Carr was 20 years old, a farm boy from Chakotah, Oklahoma. He had joined the Navy in the spring of 1942, trained as a gunner at Great Lakes, and come aboard the Roberts only 6 months before. This was his first surface battle. His crew, 10 men with an average age of 21, had been firing without a break since 45 minutes past 7. In that time, they had hurled more than 300 rounds at the enemy. Now their ammunition was almost gone. At 15 minutes past 8, the Roberts' luck began to run out. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers had her boxed in. Chikuma to the north, Tone to the northeast, Haguro to the northwest. All three were closing. And the sea room, the little ship needed to keep dancing, was shrinking with every second. 6,000 yards, 5,000, 4,000. The smoke was thinning. The room to maneuver was gone. And the Roberts was about to take her first real hit. At 20 minutes past 8, an 8-inch shell from Chikuma struck the Roberts amidships on the port side. It punched through the thin plating, tore through the galley, and passed out the starboard side without exploding, leaving a hole 3 feet wide. The sea began to pour into the lower decks. Damage control teams threw themselves at the wound, stuffing mattresses into the gaps, shoring up the buckled bulkheads with timber and muscle. The Roberts took on a list, leaning 5 degrees to port. 2 minutes later, a second shell arrived, and this one did explode. The blast tore through the crew's berthing compartment and killed 6 men where they stood. It ruptured the steam line, and superheated steam roared through the passageway, scalding 4 more sailors. The ship's speed fell to 24 knots, then to 20. One boiler was gone. Below, Trowbridge fought like a man possessed to keep the other one alive. At 25 minutes past 8, Paul Carr's aftergun lost its electrical power. The motors that swung the mount stopped dead. The hydraulic ram that fed the shells stopped. The firing circuit went cold. The gun would have to be worked entirely by hand. Now, Carr's crew had trained for exactly this, because every destroyer escort crew trained for the day the power failed under fire. They knew how to run the gun on muscle alone. It only took longer, and it took everything they had. The trainer and pointer heaved on hand cranks to swing the mount and aim it. The loader and rammer lifted each shell by hand, 54 pounds of steel and explosive, and drove it into the breach by main force. The gun captain triggered the firing pin by hand. The rate of fire fell from 15 rounds a minute to 6, maybe 7. If the men were fast, Carr's men were fast. They kept firing. They cranked the heavy mount around toward Tone, wrestled a shell up and rammed it home, and fired. The recoil slammed back with the force of 8 tons, and the mount shuddered, and the deck plates bent beneath their boots. Load another, ram it, 6 rounds a minute. Every one of them wrung out by hand from exhausted arms. The barrel glowed red now, radiating a furnace heat into the closed steel box where the men worked. The temperature inside climbed past 130 degrees. They were soaked through with sweat, with seawater from the near misses, with steam drifting up from the ruptured lines below, and still they fired, because the gun was the only thing they had. And as long as it spoke, the Roberts was still fighting. At 30 minutes past 8, the disaster came. Somewhere in the searing heat of the mount, a powder charge cooked off on its own, ignited by the sheer heat of the overworked breech. The explosion tore through the gun mount in a single white flash. It killed 3 men on the spot and wounded 7 more. Shrapnel shredded the cramped interior. The blast picked Paul Carr up and threw him backward against the bulkhead, and a jagged shard of steel opened him from neck to groin. He fell to the deck, his body torn open, and he was dying, and he knew it. But Paul Carr was not finished. Through the smoke and the ringing dark, his eyes found the ammunition rack and the single shell that still lay there, the last round in the after magazine. He began to crawl toward it, dragging his ruined body across the buckled steel. He reached it. He got his arms around it, 54 pounds of shell, and tried to lift it. He could not stand. He could not even rise to his knees. So he held that last shell against his chest while his blood ran out across the deck. And he looked toward the shattered breech, and he looked at what was left of his crew, and he begged them to load it, to fire it, to keep fighting. A machinist's mate named Samar came through the wreckage and found him there, cradling the shell like a child, his lips moving, asking, pleading that they put it in the gun. Goheen took in the ruined mount in a single glance. The breech was shattered. The firing mechanism was gone. There was no gun left to fire. No way on earth to send that last round at the enemy. But Carr did not seem to understand that, or perhaps he understood it and simply refused to accept it. Goheen reached down and gently took the heavy shell from his arms and set it aside. And then he got his hands under the wounded gunner and tried to lift him, tried to carry him away from the smoking ruin of the mount to whatever safety was left aboard the dying ship. Carr fought him, Avatorn open. Even with the deck slick beneath him, he fought to stay. He kept pointing back at the breach. He kept trying to make Goheen see what he saw. The one thing that still mattered in his fading world. Load the shell. Fire the gun. Do not stop. Goheen held him and would not let go. And slowly the strength went out of the young man from Oklahoma. He died a few minutes later, still reaching in his mind toward the gun he had served until the very end. Around him, the afterdeck of the Roberts was a scene from a nightmare. Torn steel and drifting smoke and the bodies of the men he had fought beside, but the gun that Paul Carr had kept firing by hand, long after the power failed, long after any sane man would have quit, had bought the carrier still more minutes. And every one of those minutes was a life somewhere behind them. The Roberts was hurt now, hurt badly. She was down by the bow, listing to port, one boiler dead and the other laboring, fires gnawing at her insides, both of her guns finally silent. She had done more than anyone had any right to ask of her. She had charged a battleship. She had fired torpedoes into a wall of cruisers. She had knocked out a turret on a ship many times her size. She had taken the enemy's fire onto herself and away from the carriers she was sworn to protect. And now, at last, she was beginning to die. But her ordeal, and the ordeal of the men who sailed her, was far from over. The hardest hours still lay ahead, out on the open water, under the sun, and in the dark, at 35 minutes past 8, the blow came that ended the fight. A 14-inch shell, fired from one of the Japanese battleships, struck the Roberts on the starboard side and drove deep into her before it burst. The explosion tore a hole in her hull 40 feet long and 10 feet wide, a wound no ship her size could survive. The number 2 engine room flooded in half a minute. 8 more men died in that instant. The Roberts' speed collapsed from 10 knots to 5, and then to nothing at all. She lay dead in the water, powerless, her steering gone. 3 feet of sea sloshing through her lower decks, fires burning in 4 compartments at once. She was settling by the stern, and every man aboard could feel it. The little ship was going down. Copeland gave the order to bring the remaining crew topside. There was nothing more the ship could do. Still, the enemy pounded her 6-inch rounds from a light cruiser, 8-inch rounds from Haguro, salvo after salvo, hammering the helpless hulk. Each hit killed more men, wounded more, turned more of the deck into ruin. The Roberts had become a stationary target, and the enemy meant to finish her. At 10 minutes past 9, Copeland gave the order no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. By then, more than 100 of his men were already dead or missing. The survivors began going over the side into the sea. They had 3 inflatable life rafts, but shellfire had destroyed 2 of them. Only one remained, meant to hold 16 men. They put the wounded into it. Everyone else went into the water. A few floater nets drifted nearby, and the men clung to them and to anything else that would hold them up, scraps of debris, empty shell casings, broken planks of wood. At 35 minutes past 9, the Samuel B. Roberts rolled to port, her bow lifted out of the sea and pointed at the sky. En Hestan slew Una, and for 10 long seconds she hung there as if unwilling to go. Then she slipped beneath the surface and was gone. More than 300 feet of warship vanished into the Philippine Sea, sinking down and down into water more than 3,000 feet deep. She had fought a battleship, and she had lost, and there was not a man in the water who was not proud of her. More than 100 men floated where she had been. Many were wounded, torn by shrapnel, burned, their bones broken. All of them were coated in fuel oil, thick black crude from the ship's ruptured tanks. It got into their eyes and blinded them. It got into their mouths and made them retch. It coated their skin and their hair and clung to everything it touched. Some men vomited helplessly. Others hung unconscious in their life jackets. The water was warm, warm enough to keep a man alive. But they had no food, no fresh water, and no rescue anywhere in sight around them. The battle still thundered. Japanese warships steamed past them. None of them stopped, and then, out on the horizon, something impossible happened. At 45 minutes past 9, the Japanese admiral commanding the center force, Takeo Kurita, ordered his fleet to break off and withdraw. It made no sense. He was winning. He had sunk American ships, driven off the rest. And the invasion fleet lay almost within his reach. But his cruisers had been savaged by the very destroyers, an aircraft he had thought so weak. One heavy cruiser lay dead in the water. Another was burning. A third had been torn open by a torpedo. His formation was scattered and bleeding. And something in the fury of the American attack had unnerved him. His staff kept insisting that they were fighting the main American fleet, the fleet carriers and heavy cruisers of a great task force. They were wrong. The carriers of Taffy III were converted merchant hulls with flight decks. The ships that had charged him were little tin cans and destroyer escorts with 5-inch guns, but the sheer violence of their sacrifice had convinced him he faced something far larger, and the confusion saved everything. Kurita turned north, back toward the strait he had come from. The battle off Samar was over. The invasion fleet and the thousands of soldiers still coming ashore had been saved by 7 small ships, and the men who died aboard them out on the water, the survivors did not yet know that they had won. They knew only that the battle had moved away and that a terrible silence had settled over the sea. No engines, no guns, only the slap of the waves against their life jackets. The men gathered around the single raft and the drifting nets, the wounded in the raft, everyone else holding to the edges or floating close by. They spread out across a 1/4 mile of ocean in little clusters. 2 men here, 5 there, 10 holding together, all of them trying not to drift apart. The sun climbed, and the heat became an enemy of its own. The temperature rose above 90 degrees, and there was no shade anywhere, no water to drink. The wounded suffered worst. Burns turned angry and infected within hours in the tropical heat, and in the early afternoon, the sharks came, small ones at first, circling, bumping against the men, testing them, then larger ones, drawn by the blood and the movement. Growing bolder as the hours passed, the survivors could never say for certain whether the sharks took anyone, but during that first night, 2 men who had been there were simply gone. The others heard a sudden thrashing in the dark water, and then silent, and no one wanted to say aloud what they feared. Night brought a different torment, a creeping cold as the water temperature fell and the exhausted men began to shiver. 3 more died in the darkness, of their wounds, of shock, of exposure. Their bodies were let go and drifted away into the black. The second day brought the sun back, and with it a raging thirst that drove some men to madness. They saw ships that were not there, land that did not exist, rescue planes and an empty sky. Others slipped into unconsciousness, their lips cracked and bleeding, their tongues swollen in their mouths. 5 more died that day and joined the others drifting away across the Philippine Sea. Through all of it, Robert Copeland held his men together. He would not let them give up. He organized the survivors into groups and named leaders for each one. He made them count off every hour, and any man who did not answer was shaken awake and pulled back into the group, because to fall asleep in that water was to slip under it and drown. He kept them talking. He kept them hoping over 3 days and 2 nights. 14 of his men died in the water, but 95 of them lived, and they lived because their captain refused, to the very end, to let them quit. At 45 minutes past 7 on the morning of October 27th, after 50 hours in the sea, a small American patrol craft spotted them. The lookout saw wreckage first, then bodies, then life jackets, then the pale, oil-blackened faces of living men. The patrol craft came in carefully, because there was always the fear of a trap. It stopped a little way off, and someone called across the water a question that only a real American would know how to answer: who won the World Series? And from the oil-slicked survivors came a shout, hoarse but unmistakable: the St. Louis Cardinals. The patrol craft moved in, and the rescue began. It took 4 hours to pull them all from the sea. 95 men, 50 hours after their ship went down. Some could not walk, some could not even stand, and had to be lifted aboard. Every one of them was treated for the same terrible list of hurts: thirst and burns and wounds and infection and the poison of the fuel oil in their lungs. The worst cases went to a hospital ship. The rest made the long voyage home and reached San Francisco in early December, 3 weeks before Christmas, and stepped back onto American soil as men who had seen the far edge of what a person can endure. The battle off Samar became known as the greatest last stand in the history of naval war. 7 small ships had turned back a fleet of 23, had saved an entire invasion, had prevented a disaster that might have dragged the Pacific War on for many more bloody months. The Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Copeland received the Navy Cross. Paul Carr received the Silver Star, awarded after his death for the boy who died holding his last shell. Years later, the Navy named a warship for him, so that his name would sail again. It named another for Copeland, the captain who led his crew into impossible odds and brought so many of them home. For decades, the Roberts herself lay lost somewhere in the deep. Then, in the summer of 2022, an explorer found her resting upright on the ocean floor, more than 4 miles down. The deepest shipwreck ever discovered, deeper even than the Titanic. Her hull is broken, but she is recognizable still. And the aftergun mount where Paul Carr fought and died is there in the footage, silent in the dark. The last of the survivors had died only 3 months before she was found. An old man of 97 who carried the memory of that morning all his life. That is the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. The tiny ship that charged Yamato and would not turn away. The gunner who would not let go of his last shell. The captain who would not let his men give up. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember them, because they asked for nothing, and they gave everything on a gray morning off Samar, when 7 small ships stood against a fleet and refused to run